Welcome back to Tea and Tales, where stories are meant to slow your mind and ease you gently into rest. I'm your host, and tonight we have something special for you, a quiet story about an unexpected friendship, a gentle tale of two creatures who didn't know they needed each other until they did. Before we begin, I'd like you to get settled in just the way you like it. Adjust your pillow so it's supporting your head perfectly. Pull the blankets up around you, creating that cocoon of warmth that makes everything outside feel distant and unimportant. Feel your breathing slow as we speak. There's no need to rush anywhere tonight. This is your time, a sacred space carved out just for rest and for stories that unfold slowly, naturally, like the sunset fading into evening. If you're having a day where your mind felt busy or your body felt tired, this story is for you. If you're simply seeking the comfort of someone's voice and a tale that knows how to move without hurrying, then settle in. Tonight we'll follow a dog and a cat who lived separate lives until they discovered that sometimes the best things in our world come quietly, without announcement, growing like seeds planted in good soil. Close your eyes if you're ready, or let them fall gently shut whenever they feel inclined. We're about to enter a world where two small creatures learn what it means to belong to someone besides themselves. There was a dog who lived in a house with a small but sunny yard. His name was Mason, though you might never hear anyone call him that, except in the mornings when his person would let him outside and say his name with warmth in their voice. Most of the time, people just called him Good Boy, or sometimes just whistled for him when it was time to come back inside. Mason was a medium-sized dog with soft brown fur that caught the light in a way that made it gleam like honey when the sun hit it just right. His nose was always slightly damp from sniffing at everything, always gathering information about the world around him. He had a routine that he followed each and every day, and this routine made his world feel ordered and safe in the way that only certainty can create. He would wake when his person woke, sometime in the early morning when the house was still quiet, and the world outside hadn't quite begun to stir. His person would stumble out of bed, and Mason would hear the familiar shuffle of feet on the wooden floor. This sound, this particular shuffling rhythm, meant the day was beginning, and Mason felt a gentle joy rise in his chest, like morning light slowly filling a room. He would stretch his back legs out behind him, one at a time, feeling the wonderful pull and release of muscles that had been at rest all night. Then he would push himself up onto his paws, taking a moment to stand and let his body fully wake. His bed was in the corner of the bedroom, a soft grey cushion with raised edges that he'd nested into over many years of sleeping. As soon as his person appeared in the doorway with a cup of coffee, Mason would trot over to greet them. Sometimes his person was too sleepy to bend down, so Mason would simply press his nose against their leg, breathing in the familiar scent that he loved. That scent meant his person was awake and here, and everything was right. Down the stairs they would go together, and Mason would follow close behind, listening to the click of his claws on each wooden step. In the kitchen, his person would pour him fresh water and set down his breakfast bowl. Mason would approach with patience and eat slowly, savouring each kibble. After he finished, he would drink deeply from his water bowl before padding over to the back door. His person would open it, and Mason would step out into the yard. The yard was his kingdom, his own world enclosed by a sturdy wooden fence, tall enough that he couldn't see over it, but low enough to see through the gaps and smell beyond. There were trees at the back providing shade and shelter, grass soft and familiar beneath his paws, rich with the smell of earth and growing things. He knew every inch of this space, knew where the ground was softest, where the sun lingered longest. Mason had favourite spots in the yard. There was the soft patch near the fence where he liked to lie on his belly, eyes half open as he watched beyond. There was also a covered wooden structure with an old blanket where he would rest on warm days. When his person called him back inside, Mason would come happily, ready for the next part of the day. Inside, there was often a walk to look forward to. The leash would come out, and his whole body would vibrate with excitement. He would walk beside his person, through the neighborhood, and there was so much to smell, so much to explore. Every sidewalk held stories. These walks made Mason feel connected to something larger than himself. He simply felt the joy of moving through space with his beloved person, felt the bond between them grow stronger with every step. His afternoons were often quiet. His person would go away sometimes, and though he didn't like being alone, he had learned that his person always came back. He would find a spot where sunlight came through a window and settle there to rest. His body would relax completely, and his mind would drift into that peaceful state between sleeping and waking. Sometimes he heard sounds outside, the mailman, other dogs in the distance, sounds that made his ears perk up briefly before he settled back down. When evening came, his person would return and the house would come alive again. There would be dinner for Mason and playtime if his person had energy. Sometimes they would sit together on the couch and Mason would rest his head on his person's lap, feeling the warmth of their hand on his back as they stroked his fur gently. These quiet moments were precious to him, though he didn't know to call them precious. They were simply how life should be. This was the natural order of things: to be loved, to be cared for, to rest in the presence of his person, to feel the safety and warmth that comes from being fully known and fully accepted. This was Mason's world, ordered, comfortable, filled with routine and affection. He had his person, who he loved with a devotion that asked nothing in return except presence. He had his yard, his walks, his favourite spots, his bowl of kibble, and his soft bed. He had barked at the occasional passing dog from behind the fence, and he had heard cats from afar, but his world was largely his own. He didn't know there were other ways to live. He didn't know about friendship the way humans understand it. He only knew the rhythm of his days, the comfort of familiar things, and the warmth of being loved. And that was his entire world, complete and whole, until one afternoon, when something new and unexpected began to arrive at the edges of his awareness, changing everything. Now, in the house next door, there lived a cat. Her name was Luna, and she was a sleek grey cat with bright green eyes that seemed to see everything, seemed to perceive the world in a way that humans could never quite understand. The fur on her back was the colour of storm clouds, while her belly was a lighter shade, almost silver in certain lights. She was not a large cat, but she moved with such grace and intention that she commanded the space around her. Unlike Mason, Luna had a relationship with her space that was more private, more independent. She lived with two humans who worked during the day, so Luna spent her daylight hours alone in the house, which suited her perfectly. She had never been particularly interested in dogs. In fact, she found them loud and somewhat chaotic, always wanting to play or chase or engage in something at a high energy that Luna found utterly exhausting. Luna preferred quietness. She preferred mystery. She preferred solitude. She preferred to spend her time observing the world from high perches, from windowsills, from the backs of couches and the tops of bookshelves, where she could see everything while remaining unseen herself. Luna's morning began very differently from Mason's. She would wake on her own, often before her humans, and she would stretch in the way that only cats can, arching her spine until it formed a perfect curve, extending her back legs out behind her until she felt every muscle lengthen and extend, then pushing herself forward with her front legs extended. She would do this several times, feeling her entire body come alive and connect to itself. This stretching was important to her. It was a ritual. It connected her to her body and to the day ahead. She would often stretch on the windowsill, her body silhouetted against the morning light. After stretching, she would groom herself, running her tongue over her paws and then up along her face and ears, taking care of herself in the methodical way that cats do. Luna had a favourite window in the living room, a wide sill that caught the morning sun and stayed warm for much of the day. She would jump up there with precision and grace, a jump that demonstrated her perfect understanding of space and distance, and sit in a loaf position. Her paws tucked neatly beneath her, her tail wrapped around her body, like a scarf. From here, she would watch the world outside with an observer's patience. The morning light would warm her fur, and she would watch birds move through the trees, their wings beating as they flew from branch to branch. She would watch squirrels dart across the grass, their tails twitching with nervous energy. She would watch people occasionally walking past on the sidewalk, observing them with the detached interest of someone studying another species. Humans were interesting to observe from a distance, Luna thought. They moved with such purpose, such intention, always going somewhere, always doing something. Cats, Luna knew, understood the value of simply being, the value of existing fully in a moment, without needing to fill that moment with constant activity. She would sit at that window, Effie, or hours if she could, watching and listening to the sounds of the neighbourhood, slowly waking up. Birds singing, the sound of wind moving through trees, the occasional distant sound of a car in the distance. When her humans would finally emerge from their bedrooms, moving slowly as humans did in the mornings, Luna would greet them with weaving patterns around their legs. She would do this by moving back and forth through their legs, her body making contact and creating a figure-8 pattern. But she would do this only briefly. She had breakfast expectations, and once she'd eaten, always at the same time, always with the same ritual, she would disappear into her own world again. Luna had many favourite spots in the house, each one serving a different purpose. There was the windowsill in the bedroom where she liked to nap in the afternoon, when the light shifted and the quality of warmth changed. There was a closet where she could tuck herself away if she wanted complete solitude, surrounded by soft fabrics and darkness. There was a particular armchair in the living room, where the upholstery had a texture she found very satisfying to knead. The fabric would dimple beneath her paws, and she would work at it with satisfaction. And most importantly, there was the back of the house, where a door opened onto a small patio, and from that patio, Luna could access the fence that divided her territory from the wider world. Her humans had given her access to the outside world, though they always watched carefully to make sure she was safe. They would sometimes sit on the patio with her, watching to see where she went and what she did. Luna didn't go outside every day. She was selective about it. She would choose the days when the weather suited her, when her mood inclined her to exploration. But when she did venture out, she felt the world open up in a way that being inside never quite did. Outside, the smells were richer, more complex, more alive with information. There was the smell of earth and growing things, of other creatures, of wind and rain and weather. There was freedom in being outside, though Luna never strayed far from her patio. She understood, in some deep and ancient way, that the world beyond her home could be dangerous. Predators existed. Bigger creatures existed. So she stayed close, but she moved through the small patio space with the confidence of someone who belongs there, who has claimed this territory as her own. Luna's relationship with her humans was different from Mason's relationship with his person. She cared for them, but in a more detached way. She appreciated them for the food they provided and the warmth of their home. She liked them when she was in the mood for attention, and she ignored them when she preferred to be alone. This wasn't coldness exactly. It was simply independence. Luna had never felt the need to be constantly close to her humans the way some cats did. She was content in her own company. Her world was internal in many ways. Her thoughts, her observations, her preferences all mattered deeply to her. She spent significant time in contemplation. She would sit and watch a single spot on the floor or a corner of the room for what seemed like a very long time. Her eyes unfocused, her body still and calm, her mind somewhere else entirely. People sometimes wondered what cats thought about during these moments, and if they could have asked Luna, she might not have had an easy answer. Perhaps she was thinking about the rustling she'd heard in the walls. Perhaps she was remembering the taste of a bird. Perhaps she was thinking about nothing at all, simply existing in a state of peaceful awareness. But it didn't matter to her what anyone else thought. She was present and absent at the same time, which seemed to Luna like the most sensible way to live. This was Luna's world before the story began. Solitary, serene, ordered according to her own preferences and her own understanding of what a good life should be. She moved through her days with a kind of grace, a quiet confidence, a knowledge that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She had heard dogs barking from the neighbourhood, and she had heard the sounds of humans calling their pets in distant voices, but these things barely registered as important. They were background noise, the ambient sound of a world that didn't affect her directly, didn't touch her carefully ordered existence. She was content in her own company, and she didn't imagine that would ever change. She didn't imagine that across the fence, separated by just a few feet of space and a wooden barrier, there was a dog named Mason who spent his days in his own rhythm, moving through his own routines, unaware that she existed at all. These two creatures lived in their separate worlds, their own perfect little kingdoms side by side, and neither one had any reason to think their lives would ever intersect or change in any meaningful way. The afternoon was warm and golden, the kind of perfect day that makes you want to slow down and simply exist in the space of comfort and warmth. Mason was in his favourite spot near the fence, lying on his belly in the soft grass, his nose resting on his paws, his eyes half closed, as he watched the fence line and the world beyond. The sun warmed his brown fur, and he felt completely at peace. He wasn't really watching for anything in particular. He was simply in that peaceful state of being that dogs fall into sometimes, alert enough to notice if something interesting happened, but mostly just present with the feeling of the sun on his fur and the grass beneath him, the smell of earth in his nostrils, the gentle breeze moving around him. The fence was an old wooden fence weathered by years of sun and rain. It wasn't perfectly solid. There were small gaps between the boards here and there, spaces created by the natural warping of wood over time. These small gaps allowed glimpses into the neighbouring yard, and if a creature was small enough or determined enough, they provided access to the world on the other side. Mason knew these spaces existed, but he rarely thought about them. They were simply part of the landscape of his world, neither important nor unimportant. And then, on this particular afternoon, something moved on the other side of the fence. It was quick, just a shadow really, a shift in the quality of light that suggested something living had passed by, something that hadn't been there a moment before and was now. Mason's ears perked up, standing at attention. His eyes opened more fully, his pupils dilating as he adjusted his focus. A moment later, he saw it clearly. A cat. She was sleek and grey, her body moving with the kind of grace and precision that only cats possess. She was moving along the fence line with a careful, deliberate grace, one paw in front of the other, her tail moving gently side to side in a rhythm that seemed to match some music only she could hear. She hadn't noticed Mason, or if she had, she was pretending not to. She was simply moving through the world, exploring her territory, living her life with the independence that cats seem to understand instinctively. Mason watched her, his whole body still except for his watching eyes. Something about the watching felt important. He couldn't have explained why, even if he'd known how to explain things. He simply knew that this was something his mind wanted to record, to remember, to hold on to, the way she moved, the colour of her fur, the confidence in her step. The cat moved out of sight, disappearing around the corner of the fence where it met the house next door, and Mason was left with the simple fact of her existence. There was a cat. She was there on the other side of the fence, and something had shifted, though Mason couldn't possibly have known what. Something had changed in the world, something small and quiet but significant, the knowledge that he was not alone, that there was another creature living nearby, moving through her own routines, just as he moved through his. At that exact same moment, which felt to each of them like it might have been the most important moment in time, on the other side of the fence, Luna was investigating a smell. She'd caught something interesting on the breeze, something distinctive that suggested dog, and she was curious enough to follow it to the fence and see what she could discover. She approached the fence with her usual confidence and grace, moving slowly, pausing to sniff at various points along the wooden barrier. There was information in these scents, stories written in the language of smell. A dog had been here. This dog had walked along the fence. This dog had marked territory. This dog was real and present. And then, as she was passing one particular spot, she caught a scent that was distinctly dog, and it was close. Very close, so much closer than she'd expected. She paused, her whiskers twitching with the sensitivity they possessed, her body going very still. Her ears rotated to catch any sounds. There was a gap in the fence at about nose level, and if she stood on her hind legs she could see through it, which meant that if she looked through that gap, she might see the dog that was producing this scent. But Luna didn't immediately look. Instead, she remained very still for a long moment, processing this information and considering her options. There was a dog on the other side of the fence, and he was near, very near, close enough that she could smell him clearly. Close enough that he could probably smell her too if he was paying attention. She didn't feel afraid exactly, but she felt cautious. Dogs were unpredictable in ways that Luna found difficult to understand. They were loud. They wanted to play. They wanted to chase. They were often overly interested in things that didn't concern them. Luna preferred creatures that minded their own business, that respected the natural order of things. They were curious, dogs were, but their curiosity seemed to lack the refinement and patience that Luna valued. She preferred to observe. She preferred to think before acting. Dogs didn't seem to understand the value of thinking things through. After a moment of consideration, Luna moved away from the fence and returned to her patio, but she didn't forget what she had found. The knowledge stayed with her, warm and present in her mind. Neither did Mason, lying in his spot in the grass, forget. Something had happened that afternoon, something small but real, something that had rippled through both their worlds. A dog and a cat had become aware of each other's existence, separated by a fence, observed in passing, but not directly encountered. Not yet. Neither of them understood the significance of this moment. Not really. But somewhere deep in the way that animals understand things without words or explanations, they both felt it. The sense that the world had become slightly more interesting, slightly less predictable than it had been before. The knowledge that they were not alone. That evening, as the sun moved lower in the sky and the light took on a golden, slanting quality that turned everything soft and beautiful, Mason returned to his spot near the fence one more time. He didn't consciously decide to do this. He simply found his paws carrying him to that place, as though something was drawing him there. He lay down in the grass and his eyes moved across the fence line, searching without quite knowing what he was searching for. He half expected to see that grey shape again, that glimpse of movement that had captured his attention so completely earlier. And when he didn't see it, he felt something like disappointment, though he wouldn't have called it that. It was simply a shift in the expected pattern of things, a disruption in the way he'd thought the afternoon would unfold. He had seen something new, something that had never been part of his world before, and now he wanted to see it again. The wanting itself was new to him. He was used to wanting his person to come home, used to wanting food when his bowl was empty, used to wanting to go on walks and feel the leash in his person's hand, but wanting to see something again, without being able to call for it, without being able to make it happen through some action of his own. This was different. This was entirely new. He couldn't tell his person about it because he didn't have the words, didn't have a way to communicate this desire. He could only feel it, sitting in his belly, warm and insistent and confusing. As the light continued to fade, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple, Mason remained in his spot. He didn't move until his person called him inside, back into the house for dinner and evening time. But even as he ate his kibble, even as he sat with his person on the couch, some part of his mind remained at the fence, remembering that moment, remembering the grey cat moving with such perfect grace, remembering the way his whole body had responded to the sight of her. He rested his head on his person's lap and felt their hand on his back, but his thoughts were elsewhere, beyond the fence in the neighbouring yard where the cat lived. And on the other side of the fence, Luna sat on her patio as the shadows grew longer and the light changed colour. The sun hung low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the ground. Her eyes were thoughtful, watching the way the light was transforming her familiar territory into something that looked almost like a different place. She was remembering the scent of the dog, the knowledge that he was there, close, living his life, just a fence width away. She had spent so long thinking of her world as complete, as needing nothing beyond what it already contained. She had believed that her solitude was enough, that her independence was all she required. But now there was this, the awareness of something other. Another creature, a dog. She didn't know if she wanted to encounter him again. She didn't know if it would be a good thing or a bad thing if their paths crossed more directly. Dogs could be unpredictable, and Luna valued predictability. They could be loud and Luna preferred quiet, but the knowledge was there, planted in her mind like a seed, and it would grow whether she intended it to or not. That was the thing about new information, about new awareness. Once it was inside your mind, once you knew something, you couldn't unknow it. The world had been one way, and now it was another. Her humans called her inside as the evening grew darker. She came to the door, but her mind remained partially outside, on the patio, at the fence. She ate her dinner, with her usual precision, making each meal a ritual. She spent time grooming herself, running her tongue over her paws and washing her face. She settled into her favourite armchair and let her humans pet her for a few minutes. But something had shifted in the way she experienced the world. The house felt different now, smaller somehow, less like her entire universe, and more like just one part of something larger. She was aware of the world beyond the walls, aware of the dog on the other side of the fence. The two creatures had seen each other, or nearly seen each other, and the world had shifted just slightly on its axis. Tomorrow would be different from today, though neither of them could know how or why, or what it would mean. The knowledge they possessed was small and simple, but it was enough to change things. They had learned that they were not alone. The light faded completely from the sky, colour draining away into soft greys and blacks. Stars began to appear in the darkness above, one by one, growing brighter as the night deepened around them. And in their separate homes, in their separate rooms on opposite sides of a wooden fence, Mason and Luna settled down to sleep. But their sleep was different tonight. Their dreams were different. The usual dreams didn't come. Instead, somewhere in the space between waking and dreaming, between consciousness and unconsciousness, they were both thinking about that moment of awareness, that sudden knowledge that they were not alone in the world, the way they had always believed. The fence that divided their yards suddenly seemed less like a permanent wall and more like something else. A boundary, yes, but also a possibility, a threshold between two worlds that were separate but connected. And as they drifted off into the peace of sleep, both of them were changed by that small, quiet moment of connection. Changed in ways they would only understand as time went on, as the days unfolded and revealed what this new awareness would mean for their separate lives. The seed had been planted. Now it would grow in the darkness, in the quiet of the night, in the space between one day and the next. The next morning came as mornings do, soft and gradual, with light returning to the world in slow increments. Mason woke to the sound of his person moving around in the bedroom, and the familiar routine began again. But something was different this time, though Mason couldn't have explained it. As he padded down the stairs and ate his breakfast, part of his attention remained elsewhere, fixed on a place beyond his walls, on the other side of the fence where he had seen the grey cat yesterday. After breakfast, his person opened the back door, and Mason stepped out into the yard with new purpose. The morning was cool and clear, the grass still damp with dew that soaked into his paws as he walked. He made his way to the fence, to that same spot where he had lain the afternoon before. He stood very still, his nose working, trying to catch her scent on the breeze. The smell was there, faint but distinct, telling him that yes, she was real. She had been here, and she still existed, just a fence width away. He didn't bark. Something told him that barking would be wrong, that it would somehow break whatever delicate thing was forming between them. Instead, he simply stood at the fence and listened, his ears rotating to catch any small sound. A bird sang in a tree. Wind moved through the branches overhead. The world was full of sound, but none of it was the sound of the cat. He waited, not knowing how long he was waiting for or what exactly he expected to find. He simply stood in the morning light and held his awareness open to the possibility of her. Hours seemed to pass. The sun moved higher in the sky. His person called him back inside, and Mason went, but reluctantly. Something in him wanted to stay there, wanted to keep that vigil at the fence, wanted to maintain that connection to the world beyond. On the other side of the fence, Luna was awake and moving through her own morning with her usual deliberate grace. She stretched on her windowsill, luxuriating in the quality of the morning light that made her fur glow. She groomed herself with meticulous care, running her tongue over her paws and between her toes, washing her face with the precise movements that cats have perfected over millennia. But as she groomed, her mind was elsewhere, turned toward the fence and the dog she knew was out there. She could hear sounds from his yard sometimes, the click of his claws on the fence boards, the soft thump of his body against the ground. She knew he was there, and she found herself wondering about him more than she expected to. When her humans opened the patio door, Luna stepped outside with a new sense of purpose. The morning air filled her lungs, and she padded across the patio toward the fence. She didn't go directly to the place where the gap was. Instead, she moved around the perimeter of her space, marking the boundaries of her territory with her face, rubbing against the fence boards to leave her scent. She was broadcasting her presence, making herself known in the way that cats do, and then, drawn by something she didn't fully understand, she found herself at that particular gap in the fence, the one where the wood had warped over the years and created a space just large enough for a cat to peek through. She pressed her face near the gap and breathed in deeply. The dog's scent was strongest here, richer and more complex than she had expected. There was dirt and grass and the smell of his food, but underneath all of that was something warm and alive, something that didn't smell aggressive or dangerous the way the scent of some dogs did. This dog smelled curious. He smelled gentle even. She pulled back from the gap and sat down in the grass, her tail curling around her body. The sun was warm on her fur, and she sat very still, thinking. The knowing was there now, the certainty that the dog had been here, had stood in this very spot, and had been thinking about her, just as she had been thinking about him. Days passed, and a pattern began to form. Mason would go to the fence in the morning, and in the evening, standing in his favourite spot and waiting. Luna would emerge onto her patio and move toward the gap in the fence, pressing her face near it and breathing in the scent of the dog. They never directly encountered each other. There was always the fence between them, the wooden barrier that kept them separate, even as it connected them. But they were learning. They were beginning to understand that the other creature existed, that they were not alone in this small corner of the world. They were learning the rhythms of the other's days. Mason learned that Luna would appear on her patio in the morning after the light had reached a certain angle, and in the afternoon when the sun hung high in the sky and cast sharp shadows. Luna learned that Mason would come to the fence after his person had let him outside, and again in the evening before the light drained from the sky. They began to anticipate each other's presence. They began to expect it, and in that expectation, something shifted. What had been curiosity began to transform into something else, something that wasn't quite friendship yet, but was moving in that direction. It was the seed of connection, beginning to grow in the dark soil between them. One afternoon, about a week after that first moment of awareness, something different happened. The sky had been growing darker all morning, clouds gathering and thickening until the light took on a strange, muted quality. The air felt heavy and electric, the way it does before a storm. Mason felt restless. He paced around the house, unable to settle down even though his person tried to comfort him. He wanted to go outside, wanted to be at the fence, but something about the quality of the air made him nervous. When his person finally opened the back door, he rushed out into the yard, moving quickly to his spot. The fence line was quiet. No sign of the cat. The wind was picking up, moving the branches of the trees with more force, and the smell of rain was starting to fill the air. Mason lifted his nose to the sky, breathing in the scent of the approaching storm. He should probably have gone back inside, but he didn't. He waited. Luna felt the coming storm too. She had been resting on her favourite windowsill when she became aware of the change in the air. Cats are sensitive to barometric pressure, to the subtle shifts in atmosphere that precede a storm, and Luna felt the change as a kind of calling. She wanted to be outside. She wanted to feel the wind and the electricity in the air. When her humans opened the patio door to bring in some plants that were sitting outside, Luna slipped through the opening and padded onto the patio. The wind was stronger here, tousling her fur and making it stand up slightly around her face. She could smell the rain coming, could sense the power gathering in the clouds above. She made her way to the fence drawn by the same pull that was drawing the dog. She knew he would be there. So, Mahau, she just knew. Mason saw her arrive at the fence. He heard her before he saw her, heard the soft pad of her paws on the ground, and his whole body went alert. His ears perked forward. His breath came faster. She appeared at the gap in the fence, and for the first time, they were close enough to see each other with true clarity. Her eyes were green and luminous in the strange light before the storm, almost glowing with an inner fire. Her fur seemed to ripple as the wind moved through it, making her appear almost ethereal, almost like she might disappear if he looked away. She didn't look aggressive or afraid. She simply looked like she had looked before, like a creature moving through the world with intention and grace, with a kind of confident calm that suggested she understood the nature of storms and could face them without fear. Mason's tail began to wag slightly, a tentative movement that expressed his joy at seeing her, his relief that she had come to meet him just as he had hoped she would. He took a small step closer to the fence, his whole body moving toward her with an urgency that he couldn't control, and Luna did not move away. She held her ground, watching him with those green eyes, her body still, but her eyes alive with emotion. Neither of them made a sound. There was just the wind and the distant sound of thunder rolling across the sky, drawing closer with each moment. There was just the two of them, separated by wood but connected by something that had no need for words or explanations, something that existed in the space between their hearts. The first drops of rain began to fall then, fat drops that splattered against the ground and against the fence. The wind increased and the light darkened further. Luna didn't retreat, neither did Mason. They stood there facing each other through the gap in the fence as the storm moved in around them. The rain began in earnest, coming down in sheets that soaked the ground and pelted against the fence boards. Mason felt the rain on his fur, cool and alive, and he stood very still, not wanting to break whatever spell had fallen over this moment. Luna felt the rain too, felt the way it was making her fur stick to her skin, but she didn't move. She was experiencing this moment with the full weight of her presence and her attention. It was as though the storm had created a space where they could meet, where the boundary between their two worlds became permeable. They were close. They were sharing the same air. They were as connected as two creatures separated by a fence could possibly be. And then, as suddenly as it had arrived, the rain began to ease. The wind died down. The thunder moved off into the distance, rolling away toward the far horizon. The light, which had been dark and strange, began to normalize, though the sun was still hidden by clouds. Mason shook himself, water flying from his fur. Luna stepped back from the fence with her usual grace, though her fur was plastered to her body, making her look smaller than she really was. She looked at him once more, those green eyes meeting his, and then she turned and walked back toward her patio. Mason watched her go, his heart full in a way that he couldn't understand, but that felt absolutely right. When his person called him back inside, he went without resistance, even though water dripped from his fur onto the kitchen floor. His person toweled him off with care, making sure he was dry before settling him on his favourite cushion. But Mason's mind wasn't on the comfort of being dry and warm. His mind was at the fence, replaying that moment over and over. She had been there. They had looked at each other. They had shared that space during the storm. It had been a real moment, a real connection, and it had changed something. That evening, as night fell and darkness covered the world, Mason slept deeper than he had in a very long time. His dreams were peaceful and full of the image of green eyes looking at him through a gap in a fence. Across the fence, Luna too was sleeping, curled up in her favourite spot on the armchair in the living room, her damp fur slowly drying as warmth returned to her body. She was thinking about the moment at the fence, about the dog's eyes watching hers, about the way they had stood together while the storm raged around them. She was thinking about the gentleness she had felt from him, the lack of aggression or threat. She was thinking about the way he had not barked or lunged or tried to come through the fence. He had simply stood there, present with her, sharing the moment. It was the most honest form of connection she could imagine, and it had changed something in her too. The days that followed the storm were different from the days before it. Now when Mason went to the fence, Luna would appear more readily. Now when Luna went to her patio, Mason would often be waiting. They began to spend longer periods together, separated by the fence but facing each other, sometimes moving along the fence line in tandem, sometimes simply sitting in companionable silence. They learned the sounds of each other's movements with the precision that comes from paying close attention to something that matters deeply. Mason learned the specific way that Luna's claws made a soft clicking sound on the fence boards when she walked, a rhythm that had become music to him. The sound would come, and he would feel his whole body respond with a kind of joy, a gladness that he had never experienced before. He could distinguish her footfall from other sounds in the yard, could hear the difference between her walking slowly and deliberately and her moving with purpose and speed. Luna learned the rhythm of Mason's breathing, the way his chest rose and fell as he stood alert and present. She learned the sound his paws made when he shuffled closer to the fence, the soft scraping of his claws against the ground. She learned the subtle changes in his posture that told her whether he was relaxed or tense, content or anxious. They began to communicate in ways that didn't require words, developing a system of gestures and expressions that conveyed meaning more clearly than barks or meows ever could. A slight lowering of the head meant a greeting, a signal of recognition and acknowledgement. Mason would do this when he first arrived at the fence, a small bow that said he was happy to see her. Luna would respond by lifting her chin slightly, a barely perceptible movement that was her way of returning the greeting. A slow, deliberate blink from Luna meant something like affection, a signal that she was not afraid and that she trusted the being on the other side of the fence. It was a signal of peace and contentment. Mason learned to respond to this signal with a gentle movement of his tail, a slow wagging that matched the deliberateness of her blink. They had found a language that was entirely their own, a way of speaking that bypassed the need for barks and meows and human words. It was a language of presence and attention and slow-growing trust, a communication system built on observation and care and the willingness to see past differences. Mason began to notice small things about Luna that fascinated him endlessly. The way her whiskers caught the light when she sat at a certain angle, making them glow almost white against her grey fur. The way she would sometimes close her eyes while she stood at the fence, as though she was appreciating the warmth of the sun or the feeling of the breeze on her face. The way she moved with such economy of motion, each gesture purposeful and elegant. And these observations accumulated in his mind, building a portrait of this extraordinary creature that lived so close to him and yet in such a different world. He found himself thinking about her when he was inside the house, remembering the specific shade of green her eyes were, the exact texture of her fur, the way her body seemed to contain an entire universe of grace and mystery. Luna, too, was developing a deep appreciation for the particular qualities of her canine neighbour. She noticed the warmth in his brown eyes, the way they reflected light when he looked at her. She noticed the way his body was always ready to move, always alert and alive in a way that was fundamentally different from her own, more meditative approach to existence. She noticed the gentleness in him, the lack of any aggressive impulse, the way he seemed to understand intuitively that she valued her space and her independence. She found his loyalty admirable, the way he would wait at the fence for hours if necessary, not demanding anything, simply present and content in her company. She noticed the rhythm of his heartbeat sometimes, the steady pulse of life that she could feel through the fence when they stood very close. One morning, about 2 weeks after the storm, Mason arrived at the fence to find that something had changed in the gap. The boards that had been warped before had been slightly adjusted, moved by the wind or by time, and now the gap was a little bit larger. Not large enough for either of them to squeeze through, the fence was still a barrier, but large enough that they could see each other even more clearly. Enough that they could almost touch noses if they were very careful. Mason approached the gap slowly, his heart racing in a way that he didn't fully understand. He had been thinking about this moment, wondering what it would be like to be this close to her, to truly bridge the distance that had always been between them. Luna, who was waiting on the other side, pressed forward as well. She had been waiting for him, had sensed that today was a day when something important would happen. They came very close, closer than they had ever been, close enough that they could feel each other's breath. Her breath cool and quick, his breath warm and steady, could smell each other's individual scents more fully. Mason's nose touched the space, coming near to Luna's nose. It wasn't a touch exactly, but it was close. It was an acknowledgement, a gesture of tenderness and trust that went deeper than any words could ever express. They stood like that for a long moment, two creatures bridging the gap between them as much as they possibly could. The morning light surrounded them, warm and golden, making Luna's grey fur seem to shimmer, and catching the honey brown of Mason's coat. Neither of them moved. Neither of them wanted to break this moment, this precious space where they were as close as they had ever been, separated only by the thinnest barrier of air and wood. And in that moment, something crystallized, something that had been forming slowly over the weeks, became real and solid and undeniable. They were no longer just curious about each other. They were no longer learning whether it was safe to be near one another. They were no longer standing on the threshold of friendship. They had stepped through that threshold. They had arrived on the other side, where two separate creatures had become connected, where independence had given way to something larger and more beautiful. They were friends. It wasn't something either of them could have anticipated or predicted, but it was real as the sun on their fur and the fence beneath their paws. And as they stepped back from the fence and began their day, Mason heading back inside for his breakfast, Luna returning to her patio to groom herself, they both carried with them the absolute certainty that their world had changed forever. This was not a small thing. This was not something that could be undone or forgotten. This was a fundamental shift in the way they understood themselves and their place in the world. The following days brought small gestures of kindness that deepened their bond in ways both obvious and subtle. One afternoon, Mason's person had taken him to a nearby park, and when he returned home, he had a small treat in his mouth, a biscuit that hadn't been completely finished. He carried it to the fence and after a moment's hesitation, nudged it carefully through the gap. Luna approached the treat with caution, sniffing it thoroughly before eating it. The biscuit was salty and crunchy, flavours and textures she had never experienced before, and she found them entirely to her liking. It was a gift, she understood. A gesture from her friend on the other side of the fence saying that he had thought of her even when he was away. even when he was in a completely different place. She made a soft sound in her throat, a quiet vocalization that Mason heard from inside the house, where he'd been watching through the window. It was her way of saying thank you. Luna, in her own way, began to leave small gifts too. She brought a leaf, not just any leaf, but one that had turned a brilliant shade of orange, one that caught the light beautifully, and she placed it carefully through the gap. Mason found it the next morning when he came to the fence, golden and perfect, and he spent a long moment simply looking at it. He didn't eat it. Instead, he carried it carefully in his mouth to his person, placing it at her feet. His person looked at the leaf with confused affection, not understanding how it had come to be there, but recognizing that it mattered to Mason somehow. There was a day when Luna's humans had opened a window in the living room where it faced the fence, and a feather had blown out and landed in the yard. Mason found it, and with great care pushed it back through the fence with his nose. Luna discovered it hours later and recognized it immediately as a gift, a reciprocation of her gift of the leaf. She picked it up delicately and carried it to her windowsill, where it sat for days, a reminder of the goodness that existed in the world beyond her patio. One particularly warm afternoon, Mason's person left out a large bowl of fresh water in the yard, and Mason brought it to the fence. Or rather, he stood next to it and waited. When Luna came to investigate, he stepped aside, allowing her access to the cool water. She drank deeply, grateful for the refreshment. It was a small thing, but it was essential. It was Mason saying, "I see your needs, and I want to help meet them." It was him extending his care beyond the barrier of the fence. Luna, meanwhile, began to leave him messages in her own way. On a day when a strong wind had blown through the neighborhood, she gathered small stones and arranged them in a particular pattern at the gap in the fence, forming what almost looked like a path. It was confusing at first, but Mason understood that she was trying to communicate, trying to show him that she was thinking about him, working to bridge the distance between them in any way she could. Time seemed to move differently during these days. What had been weeks felt like moments, and yet each moment felt rich and full and meaningful. The seasons were changing. The leaves on the trees were turning red and gold and orange, preparing for their fall. The air was growing cooler, and there was a hint of something in the breeze that suggested that winter would be coming. But neither Mason nor Luna was concerned about the changing seasons. They had each other. They had found something that transcended the boundaries of their different worlds, and it was enough. Mason's person noticed something different about him in the days that followed the small gestures of kindness. He was happier, more content, more peaceful when he spent time at the fence. His person would watch him through the window sometimes, watching this strange dog who would stand at the fence for long periods, his tail wagging slowly and steadily, his body relaxed and calm. There was something almost meditative about the way he would stand there, waiting patiently, his eyes soft and his shoulders loose. They didn't understand what had drawn Mason to this particular spot, but they could see that whatever it was brought him deep and abiding joy. So they allowed it. They encouraged it, even, opening the back door often and letting him spend as much time at the fence as he wanted. They would sometimes find him standing there in the early morning light, or in the golden afternoon, or in the soft glow of evening. It didn't matter what time of day it was. He would be at the fence, waiting, hoping, present. His person would sometimes ask themselves what he saw in that fence, what he was looking at so intently. If they had known, if they could have understood the full depth of what was happening on the other side of that wooden barrier, they would have been amazed at the capacity for love that their pet possessed, the ability to connect with another creature across the boundaries that seemed to separate their worlds. Luna's humans too noticed a change in their cat over these weeks. Luna, who had always been independent and somewhat aloof, seemed happier. She spent more time on her patio, more time engaged with the world around her. She was more affectionate, more willing to accept attention and physical contact. She would sometimes sit on their laps in the evening, something she had never been particularly inclined to do before. She seemed to be at peace in a way she hadn't been before, content and centered in a manner that suggested something fundamental had shifted in her inner landscape. They assumed perhaps it was the good weather, the way that animals often become more content when the weather is pleasant and the days are warm. They might have thought it was the changing of the seasons, something in the air that made Luna feel more connected to the world. They didn't realize that the change had come from something deeper, something that transcended seasons and weather. It had come from a connection that had formed across a fence between their cat and a neighbour's dog, from an unexpected friendship that had grown in the space between two very different creatures. But Mason and Luna knew. They knew the truth of what had happened between them. They knew that they had found something precious and rare, something that many creatures search for throughout their entire lives, but never find. A true friend, someone who saw them clearly and accepted them fully, someone who understood their nature and celebrated it rather than trying to change it. The fence still stood between them, still separated their worlds and their daily routines. But the fence had also become a bridge, a place where two separate lives had intersected and intertwined, where the boundaries between them had become permeable and alive with possibility. The fence had become the boundary of something beautiful, something that had been worth waiting for, worth the patience and the slow growth, and the willingness to see past differences and to recognize kinship. They had become best friends, and there was nothing in the world that could change that truth. It was written in the language they had created together, in the small gifts they exchanged, in the way they stood together at the gap in the fence. It was written in their eyes when they looked at each other, in the gentleness of their movements around one another. It was real and solid and true, grounded in something far deeper than circumstance or proximity. They had chosen each other. They had seen each other and recognized themselves in that other being, had found something in each other that made them feel more complete, more alive, more fully themselves than they had ever felt before. And as the seasons continued to turn and the world around them changed, as leaves fell and snow came, and as spring returned, one thing remained constant and unchanging. They had each other, and that was everything. The dog and the cat who became best friends. Cozy Sleep Story, Part 3. The gift-giving continued into the weeks that followed, becoming a kind of rhythm that both creatures understood without ever having to discuss it. Mason brought a smooth stone he had found buried in the yard during a digging expedition, one that fit perfectly in the palm of a human hand and was warm from the afternoon sun. He carried it to the fence with such care, such obvious intention, that Luna knew immediately this was something special. She examined it from every angle, running her nose across its surface, feeling the warmth that still lingered from his paws. She understood that he had chosen this stone specifically for her, that he had been thinking of her as he dug, imagining how it might feel to her, what quality of gift would best express what he was feeling. She left it in a place of honor on her patio in a small patch of sunlight where she could see it from her favourite window. Every morning when she stepped outside, she would approach that stone and remember Mason, remember the gesture, remember that she was thought of and cared for by someone who existed just beyond her reach. Luna brought him something equally precious, a feather, but not just any feather. It was a blue jay feather, electric blue and striped with black, a feather that glowed like a piece of the sky itself. She had found it caught in the branches near the fence, and something about it had made her think of Mason immediately. She worked to free it carefully, using her teeth and her paws with delicate precision, taking care not to damage it. When she finally had it loose, she carried it to the gap in the fence and positioned it where she knew he would find it. The feather arrived at dawn when the light was soft and golden, and it seemed to catch every bit of that light, seeming to glow from within. Mason discovered it on his morning walk to the fence, and he stood very still, hardly able to believe. Something so beautiful had been given to him. He brought it inside and placed it on the windowsill where the light could pass through it, and he would sit and look at it for long periods, thinking about Luna and the effort she must have made to bring this gift to him. He thought about her careful movements, her consideration and gentleness. Every time he looked at that feather, he felt the full weight of her love for him, a love that transcended the barrier of the fence, a love that was expressed not in dramatic gestures, but in small, quiet moments of thoughtfulness and care. They began to exchange these gifts more regularly, and it became a kind of conversation between them. A gift from Mason might be a piece of something he found during his adventures in the yard, a cool stone, a smooth piece of wood, a stick of interesting shape. Luna would respond with something she found or gathered, a leaf of particular beauty, a feather, sometimes even a small flower that she had managed to guide to a spot where Mason could find it. Each gift was like a word in a sentence, a syllable in a longer conversation about what they felt for each other. They were communicating things that couldn't be said in barks or meows, things that required the physicality of an object, the tangibility of something that could be held and examined and treasured. These gifts were all the declarations of love and friendship and commitment that neither of them could make in any other way. One afternoon, Mason's person brought home a toy, a soft rubber ball that bounced with surprising height and rolled in unpredictable directions. Mason was meant to play with it, to chase it around the yard and burn off energy. But instead, after he had played with it for a few minutes, he picked it up in his mouth and carried it to the fence. He worked it carefully through the gap, though it was larger than most of the gifts he had tried to pass through. It stuck for a moment, wedged in the opening, and he had to push with his nose to dislodge it. When it finally popped through to the other side, Mason felt a surge of satisfaction. Luna watched this gift arrive with confusion at first. She'd never seen an object like this before, something so soft and bouncy. She approached it cautiously, as though it might bite or spring to life. She sniffed it thoroughly, and then, understanding that it was safe, she began to play with it in her own way, batting it with her paws, watching as it rolled across the patio. She discovered that if she hit it just right, it would bounce, and she spent a long time playing with this new toy, fully engaged and delighted. This was different from the other gifts. This one made her move and think and react. This one engaged her entire body in play. She was grateful for it in a new way, grateful not just for the thoughtfulness, but for the experience it opened up to her, the joy of playing with something new. As the autumn deepened and the leaves grew more sparse on the branches, as the light began to change and take on that golden quality that comes in the later part of the season, Mason and Luna found themselves spending even more time together at the fence. They were no longer separated by the barrier in any meaningful way. Yes, the wood was still there. Yes, they could not physically cross from one side to the other, but in every way that mattered, they were together. They shared the same air at the gap. They breathed the same breeze. They looked into each other's eyes across the wooden planks, and what they saw was recognition, understanding, a complete acceptance of who the other was and what the other needed. The first real exploration of the garden came on an afternoon when the winter sun hung low and bright in a clear sky, creating long shadows and brilliant pockets of light. Mason's person had been working in the yard, clearing away dead plants and preparing the beds for winter. In doing so, they had accidentally left the side gate slightly ajar, not fully latched. Mason discovered this opening with a sense of discovery, and for the first time he was able to move beyond his own yard in the direction of the fence. He didn't leave his space, his loyalty kept him from doing that, but he could now see around the corner of the fence, could see into Luna's yard more fully than he ever had before. He walked slowly, carefully, his heart racing at this new perspective. He found himself at the far corner of the fence, a place where a wooden gate separated the two properties. The gate was also slightly ajar, and through the gap he could see Luna on her patio, lying in the winter sunlight. She lifted her head as if sensing his presence, and their eyes met across a space they had never shared before. It was a moment of profound realization. They could perhaps find a way to meet on more equal ground. They could potentially enter each other's worlds more fully than they had ever imagined. For weeks after this discovery, Mason found himself spending time exploring the expanded view he now had of the world beyond his direct yard. He would stand at the side gate and look toward Luna's patio, toward the garden that surrounded her home, toward the wider landscape that existed beyond the fence. Luna, too, seemed to be thinking about this new possibility. She would walk toward the gate, on her side, approaching it with cautious curiosity, as if testing the waters of what it might mean to cross that boundary. Neither of them actually ventured through. The gates remained mostly closed, and the fear of being separated permanently from their homes, of losing the security of their familiar spaces, kept them from making that jump. But the possibility now existed in their minds, and with that possibility came a new understanding, that their friendship was not dependent on the fence, that it could survive and even thrive in new sea, contexts and new configurations. One afternoon in late winter, when the sun was particularly bright and the air had that crystalline quality that comes after a fresh snow, Luna's humans left the patio door open just a crack to allow fresh air into the house. Luna was alert to every change in her environment, and she noticed immediately. She stood at the patio entrance, looking out at the expanded world now available to her. She could see past the fence to the neighbouring yard. She could hear sounds from that direction more clearly than she ever had, and she could smell something on the breeze that made her heart beat faster. Mason's scent, carried on the wind from where he was standing at the side gate, waiting, perhaps, for her to make a move. Luna stepped through the patio door and found herself in her yard in a way she had never been before. Not enclosed, not restricted. She felt the freedom of the space in a new way, felt the possibility of movement and exploration. She walked slowly toward the gate, and when she reached it, she looked through the opening toward Mason. He was standing perfectly still, his whole body alert, his eyes fixed on her. They looked at each other across the space, and something unspoken passed between them. This was no longer about a fence. This was about two creatures acknowledging that they could be together. Her, that the boundaries that had defined their relationship were not absolute and permanent. Mason's person called him back inside before either of them could take the next step. The moment was broken, the possibility was set aside for now. But they both knew that something had shifted. They knew that their friendship could now expand beyond the fence, that there was potential for a different kind of togetherness. The winter continued on, cold and clear and beautiful, and they returned to their routine of standing at the fence, of looking at each other through the gap, of standing together in companionable silence. But now there was this new knowledge, this awareness that their worlds could overlap, that the boundaries were more porous than they had ever seemed before. The fence was still there, still separating them in most practical ways, but it no longer felt quite so absolute. It felt like a choice rather than an inevitability, like something they could change if they wanted to, if circumstances allowed. As spring approached and the first hints of green began to show on the branches of the trees, Mason and Luna found themselves spending hours in the garden areas, moving along the fence line, exploring the spaces where their 2 yards met. The garden had become a kind of meeting ground, a place where they could walk together, separated only by the wooden planks, but moving in tandem, their movements synchronized and aware of each other. Mason would walk slowly, pacing himself to match Luna's more deliberate stride. Luna would pause often, allowing Mason to catch up, to be fully present with her. They moved through the awakening garden like dancers who had learned each other's rhythm completely, each knowing exactly where the other would be, how the other would move, what the other needed. The garden was beginning to change, to show signs of returning life. The bulbs that had been planted in the fall were now pushing through the soil, sending up green shoots that would soon become flowers. The trees were beginning to bud, tiny hints of colour appearing at the ends of the branches. The air was warming, and with the warmth came a sense of possibility, of new beginnings. Mason and Luna moved through this transformation together, witnessing it side by side, grateful for the chance to experience it in each other's company. They had found a way to share the natural world, to participate in the cycles of seasons together, and in doing so, they had created something that transcended the physical limitations of their separate lives. They had created a shared experience, a shared understanding of beauty and change, and the constancy of returning life. The garden had become theirs, a mutual space where they could be together, and that was everything that mattered. They would walk past the same flowering shrubs on their respective sides of the fence, pausing at the same moments to admire the delicate blooms. They would notice the same birds arriving in the branches, watch the same insects moving through the grass. Every detail of the garden became something they experienced together, a language of observation and appreciation that needed no words. There was a particular corner of the garden where an old oak tree stood, its branches stretching across both yards, its roots spreading beneath both properties. This tree became their meeting point, their sacred ground. Mason would rest against one side of the trunk, and Luna would position herself on the other side, and they could both see the gnarled bark, could both feel the ancient presence of this living thing that had been there long before either of them. The tree became a symbol of their friendship, a testament to the fact that the most important things in life often exist in spaces where boundaries blur, where separation gives way to something more profound. In the spring, when the tree began to leaf out, they watched the transformation together, and it felt like a blessing, like the natural world itself was celebrating their bond. One afternoon, during their garden time, Mason came across a shallow depression in the ground filled with rainwater from an earlier storm. The water was clear and cold, and he waded into it, then looked back toward Luna, wanting to share this discovery. Luna, watching him from her side of the fence, understood immediately what he was trying to communicate. A few moments later, she found her own small puddle on her patio, and she stood in it, her paws soaking in the cool water. It was a small thing, but it represented the essence of what they had become to each other. Creatures who could share experiences even when they couldn't be in the exact same physical space, who could mirror each other's joy and curiosity, who could be fundamentally connected despite the barriers between them. Mason learned the geography of Luna's side of the fence through careful observation. He could see the way the afternoon light caught the edge of her patio, creating a warm spot where she liked to rest. He could see where her humans had placed a small water dish, and he was grateful for that, grateful that they cared for her and provided for her comfort. He watched the windows of her house, learning which room she preferred at different times of day, understanding her rhythms and routines as if they were his own. Luna, in turn, learned Mason's patterns. She knew when his person would let him outside, knew the pace of his morning walk to the fence, knew the subtle signs that indicated whether he was anxious or content. She learned to read the smallest changes in his posture, the flicker of his ears, the set of his tail. They had become experts in each other, had developed a kind of intuitive understanding that went beyond what words could express. One warm afternoon, a butterfly arrived in the garden, a beautiful monarch with orange and black wings that seemed to glow in the sunlight. Mason watched as it fluttered through the air, and something about its freedom, its ability to move between the spaces without restriction, captured his heart. He tried to follow it, moving along the fence line, and Luna, seeing what he was doing, began to move in parallel, also following the butterfly's path. They moved together through the garden, dog and cat, separated by the fence but united in their appreciation of this small creature, this symbol of transformation and freedom. The butterfly eventually disappeared into the distance, but the memory of that shared moment remained with them, a reminder that even in a world of boundaries and limitations, there were small moments of transcendent beauty that belonged to no one and everyone at once. During warm afternoons, Mason's person would sometimes set out a bowl of cool water in the yard specifically for him, a thoughtful gesture of care. Luna began to anticipate this ritual, and she would position herself at the fence when she knew it was coming. Mason, understanding that Luna would want to share in the refreshment, would deliberately position the bowl close to the fence so that she could access it if she was brave enough to come near. It became a shared ritual, this offering of water, this simple act of providing for each other's physical needs. Sometimes they would drink from opposite sides, their noses nearly touching across the wooden barrier. Sometimes one would drink first and the other would wait patiently for their turn. These moments were profound in their simplicity. They were the essence of friendship, the willingness to provide for another's comfort, to think of their needs, to offer sustenance and care without expectation of return. The challenge came on an afternoon when the weather was turning stormy, when clouds had gathered overhead in a way that suggested rain was coming, perhaps even significant rain. Mason's person had decided to close the side gate more securely, latching it properly to prevent it from swinging open in the wind. They had also decided to bring in some of the outdoor items, preparing for the storm that was clearly on the way. In closing and latching that gate, they had inadvertently cut off Mason's expanded access to the wider view of Luna's yard. The patio area where Luna liked to rest was no longer visible from his vantage point. The path along the fence that they had begun to use together was no longer accessible. In one simple action, the physical world had changed, and with it, the carefully constructed geography of their friendship. Mason didn't understand what had happened. He went to the side gate, as he had been doing for weeks now, and found it firmly closed, firmly latched in a way it had not been before. He paced back and forth, sniffing at the seams, trying to understand why this opening that had been there had suddenly disappeared. He went back to his original spot at the fence, the gap where he could see Luna, and stood there with a kind of anxiety that he hadn't felt in a very long time. Luna, on her side, was also confused. She had been resting on her patio when she heard the sounds of the gate being secured, had heard the mechanical sounds of latches being engaged. She understood, more immediately than Mason did, that something had changed, that the new access they had been exploring was no longer available. She approached the gate on her side and found it closed. She ran her face along the seams, trying to find any opening, any possibility of crossing. There was none. For the first time since they had truly become friends, they were both feeling something like despair. The storm that was approaching only added to the sense of darkness and difficulty. The sky grew darker, the wind picked up, and they stood at their respective sides of the fence, wondering if this was the end of the expanded freedom they had begun to experience. Mason couldn't see Luna from his spot at the main fence. Luna couldn't reach the viewpoint where she could see Mason's yard from a new angle. They were back to being only what they had been before, separated by the fence, unable to access the wider possibilities that had seemed so close just moments before. When the storm came, it came with force and fury. Rain poured down in thick sheets, wind bent the trees, thunder rolled across the sky. Mason waited at the fence in his original spot, his shelter limited to a small overhang of the house, but he didn't go inside. He stood at the fence and weathered the storm, because Luna was out there somewhere, even if he couldn't see her, and he wanted to be as close to her as he could possibly be. On her side, Luna did the same, seeking what shelter she could find, but positioning herself as close to the fence as possible, as close to Mason as she could be, even though the rain was intense and the wind was trying to push her away from this spot. They stood through the storm together, separated but present, each knowing that the other was there, each refusing to give in to the darkness and the difficulty. The storm raged around them, but they held their ground, and in holding their ground, they held their friendship. They held the certainty that this temporary separation, this closing of the gate, this loss of the expanded access they had enjoyed, did not mean the end of what they had built together. It was a setback, a difficulty, a challenge, but it was not a breaking point. It was not the end. After the storm passed and the rain lightened to a drizzle, Mason's person went out to check on the yard and make sure everything was secure. They saw Mason standing at the fence, soaked through, his fur plastered to his body, his eyes distant and focused on something beyond what the human could see. They were concerned about him, about his health, about why he would refuse to come inside during such a terrible storm. They brought him in and dried him off carefully, checking him for injuries, making sure he was safe and warm. He tolerated this care with patience, but his mind was clearly elsewhere, fixed on something or someone that mattered more to him than his own physical comfort. It took time for him to relax, for the worry to fade from his body, for him to rest. But eventually he did settle, curling up on his favourite cushion, his heart still heavy with the loss of the access he had enjoyed, but his faith in his friendship with Luna unshaken. Luna spent much of the next day on her patio, examining the gate, trying once more to see if there was any way to cross, any way to reach the place where she knew Mason was. Eventually, she too had to accept that the gate was not going to open, that the barrier that had briefly seemed to diminish was back in full force. She returned to her familiar routines, rested on her favourite windowsill, allowed her humans to give her comfort and care. But she was thinking of Mason, thinking of how the storm must have been for him, wondering if he was okay, if he was worried about her the way she was worried about him. She wanted to find a way to tell him that she was fine, that she was still here, that the closing of the gate hadn't changed anything fundamental between them. The next morning brought a new possibility. Mason's person, concerned about his well-being, decided to allow him more time outside, to let him move freely around the yard, hoping that whatever was drawing him so intensely to the fence would become clear. In doing so, they left the side gate open again, not latched, just open in a way that allowed passage. Mason discovered this immediately, and he made his way to the expanded viewpoint where he could see more of Luna's yard. And there, on the patio, he saw her. Luna was sitting in a patch of sunlight, her body relaxed, her face turned toward his yard, as if she was waiting for him, as if she had been waiting there all along. When she saw him, she stood and walked to the fence line, and they made their way toward each other, along parallel paths, their movements once again synchronized and aware, their hearts once again in perfect rhythm. The challenge had tested them, had forced them to question whether their friendship could survive separation and difficulty. And in surviving it, in moving through it with faith and patience and absolute certainty in what they felt for each other, they had made their friendship even stronger. They now knew that distance didn't matter, that barriers didn't define them, that what they had built between them was strong enough to weather any storm, any difficulty, any temporary separation. They were not just friends in good times, they were friends in all times, through all challenges, no matter what the world threw at them. As the spring light grew stronger and more consistent, as the garden continued to come alive with new growth and new colour, Mason and Luna found themselves moving through the world with a kind of peaceful certainty that hadn't been there before. The gate remained open now, or at least open enough that they could pass back and forth if they truly needed to. But more importantly, they had learned something fundamental about the nature of their bond. It didn't depend on access. It didn't depend on being able to see each other or be in the same physical space. It existed in something deeper, in the realm of feeling and intention, an absolute commitment to each other's well-being. They had become more than friends who stood at a fence. They had become creatures whose lives were irrevocably intertwined, whose fates were bound together, whose existence was richer and fuller because the other existed. Mason was no longer the restless dog who had first become curious about the cat at the fence. He was a dog who had found his purpose, his reason for existing, in the connection he had forged with Luna. He was calmer, more centered, more fully himself than he had ever been. Luna was no longer the independent, somewhat aloof cat who had lived her life on her own terms, without needing much from anyone. She had learned to open herself to connection, to vulnerability, to the kind of trust and commitment that true friendship required. She was still independent, still maintained her own identity and her own preferences, but now she did so as part of a larger whole, as someone who had someone else to consider, someone else to care about, someone else to share her life with. The differences between them had initially seemed like obstacles, like reasons to keep their distance. Mason was a dog, built for activity and loyalty and devotion. Luna was a cat, built for independence and observation and measured engagement with the world. But they had learned to see these differences not as barriers, but as strengths. Mason's loyalty made Luna feel secure and cherished. Luna's independence and calm presence made Mason feel safe enough to slow down, to rest, to simply be without constantly needing to do. They completed each other, not because they were the same, but because they were different in ways that complemented and enhanced each other. The fence that had once separated them now seemed like the best thing that could have happened to them, because it had forced them to find a way to connect that transcended physical proximity that existed in a realm of pure intention and pure feeling. They had found a way to be together that honoured both their natures, that allowed them both to be completely themselves, while also being part of something larger than themselves. They had found in each other a reason to be grateful for the life they lived, grateful for all the world they inhabited, grateful for every moment they were given to spend together. And in that gratitude, in that absolute certainty of being loved and of loving in return, they had found everything they needed to be truly, completely, deeply happy. Their understanding of each other had grown so complete that they no longer needed to test the boundaries of their friendship, no longer needed to question whether what they felt was real and lasting. The differences between them had become something neither of them would have wanted to change, even if they could. Mason's exuberance and constant need for activity balanced perfectly against Luna's preference for stillness and contemplation. Where Mason would rush toward a new experience with unbridled joy, Luna would pause and observe, helping him to slow down enough to truly appreciate what he was encountering. Where Luna might withdraw from something new and uncertain, Mason would approach it with confidence, his unwavering belief in the goodness of the world giving her courage to be brave, than she might have been on her own. He learned from her restraint and her careful consideration of things. She learned from his enthusiasm and his ability to find joy in the simplest moments. They had become the best version of themselves by being together, each one bringing out qualities in the other that had been dormant or underdeveloped before. The fence that had once seemed like such an unbridgeable divide now felt almost irrelevant. It was just wood and nails and weathered paint, nothing compared to the bond that had formed between them. They had transcended the physical barriers of their world and found something that mattered far more than proximity or ease of contact. They had found a connection that was unbreakable, a friendship that existed in a realm beyond the physical. Heat that they had built between them would endure through every season, every change, every moment of uncertainty that life might bring. It was not fragile. It was not dependent on circumstances or luck. It was a fundamental fact of their existence, as real and solid as the earth beneath their paws, as constant as the sky above their heads. The days began to settle into a rhythm that felt natural and inevitable, as though this had always been the way things were meant to be. Mason and Luna had created a life together that honoured both of their needs and preferences, that allowed them to express their love in ways that felt authentic and true. They had found a balance that worked, a way of being that felt right for both of them. Every interaction between them was infused with the knowledge that they were choosing to be together, that they were choosing each other, day after day after day. The morning light would arrive, filtering through the clouds and mist, and Mason would make his way to the fence with the same sense of anticipation he had always felt. But now it was different. Now it was not anticipation mixed with uncertainty. Now it was pure joy, pure certainty that Luna would be there, that she was waiting for him, just as he was waiting for her. He would arrive at the fence and find her already there on her side, having woken early too, having thought of him in those first moments of consciousness, wanting to be present to greet him as he came to greet her. Sometimes the morning mist would still cling to the ground, creating a soft blanket of grey that made the world feel intimate and private, a space created just for them. Sometimes the sun would be breaking through the clouds, sending long shadows across the grass, making everything look golden and warm and inviting. Regardless of the weather, they would stand together in the early light, not needing to do anything or say anything, just existing in each other's presence. And that was enough. That was everything. Mason would watch as Luna stretched, extending her front legs and arching her back in that graceful way that cats have, and he would feel a surge of affection so strong that it seemed to overflow from his chest. Luna would notice Mason's tail wagging in the early morning stillness, and she would close her eyes for a moment in what Mason had learned to recognize as contentment. These small exchanges, these quiet moments of mutual appreciation, had become the foundation of their day, the anchor that held everything else in place. As the morning progressed, they would establish their routines. Mason's person would give him breakfast, and Luna's person would do the same for her, and they would eat in their respective homes, fueled for the day ahead. But then, within an hour or two, they would return to the fence and the real rituals of their day would begin. These were the moments that mattered most to them, the moments when they were fully present with each other, when the world fell away and there was nothing but the two of them and their shared understanding. Mason had learned Luna's preferred routes around the garden, and he would trace them on his side of the fence while she traced them on her side, moving together through the space that belonged to them both. They had worn subtle paths in the grass from their endless walks, paths that only they could see, trails that marked out the geography of their friendship. They walked slowly, deliberately. Their paces matched, their awareness of each other absolute. Mason would sniff at various points along the fence, checking to see what small creatures had passed, what news the wind had brought from distant places. Luna would watch the birds that landed in the shrubs, her hunter's instinct clearly active, but tempered by her contentment with Mason's presence. Sometimes a butterfly would pass by, and they would both track its flight, their heads turning in unison, their attention completely captured by this brief visitor to their shared world. They would pause at certain spots where the light was particularly beautiful, where the view was especially clear, where some quality of the place seemed to call them to stillness. In those moments of pause, they would stand side by side, separated only by the fence, and simply be. Mason might rest his nose against a gap in the fence, and Luna might position her face as close to his as the wooden planks would allow, and there would be a moment of perfect peace, a moment in which nothing else mattered and nothing else existed except their connection to each other. The middle of the day brought a different kind of ritual. As the sun climbed higher and the light became stronger and more direct, both Mason and Luna would find themselves seeking shade and coolness. On Mason's side, there was a large tree that provided a perfect refuge from the heat, its branches spreading wide and its leaves creating a canopy of dappled shadow. The roots of this tree had grown gnarled and twisted over the years, creating natural resting places where Mason could curl up in perfect comfort. On Luna's side, her patio had an overhang that offered similar protection, and beyond it, a sheltered corner where moonlight filtered through and created intricate patterns of shadow and light. They had learned to position themselves in these shaded spaces in ways that allowed them to still see each other, still be aware of the other's presence. Sometimes they could position themselves at an angle where they could see each other's faces, could maintain eye contact even as they rested. Sometimes they could only sense each other's presence, knowing the other was there through subtle sounds and smells and vibrations in the air. And there, in the cool shade, they would rest. Sometimes Mason would nap, his body heavy with the exertion of the morning's activities, his breathing deepening into sleep. Luna would remain awake, watching him, maintaining the vigil, keeping her awareness on him even as his own consciousness faded. She would watch the rise and fall of his chest, would listen to the small sounds he made in his sleep, would feel completely and utterly responsible for his well-being. Sometimes it was the reverse, and Luna would doze while Mason kept watch, alert and present, his ears swiveling toward any unusual sound, his protective instincts fully activated. Sometimes they would both rest at the same time, their consciousness drifting in parallel, their dreams perhaps intersecting in some realm where the fence didn't exist, where they could be fully together in the way that physical reality didn't allow. In these moments of simultaneous rest, there was a kind of harmony between them that seemed to transcend the normal separation of individual consciousness, as if their beings were somehow merging into a unified whole. In the afternoon, as the light began to shift and soften, they would wake from their rest, and the day would take on a different quality. This was often the time when visitors came, when children would play in yards, when the neighbourhood became more active and alive. Mason would sometimes become protective, more alert to sounds and movements, more concerned about Luna and whether she was safe and comfortable. His protective instinct was strong, born from his nature as a creature who had been bred for generations to watch over and guard the things he loved. Luna, in her calm way, would reassure him through her demeanour, through the way she seemed completely untroubled by the activity around them. She would look at him with an expression that seemed to say, "Everything is fine, we are safe, we are together, and that is all that matters." And Mason would relax, would trust her judgment, would settle back into the ease that came with her presence. She had become, over the months of their friendship, the anchor that held him steady when the world seemed chaotic or uncertain. Her presence was like a balm, soothing his anxieties, calming his fears, reminding him that despite whatever was happening in the external world, the essential connection between them remained unchanged and unchangeable. The evenings brought a cooling of temperature and a softening of light that both of them seemed to love. This was when they would engage in some of their most elaborate activities that had become as much a part of their routine as breathing. On warmer evenings, Mason's person would sometimes bring out a hose and spray water in the yard, creating a kind of cooling mist that fell gently over everything like a benevolent rain. Mason would move through this mist with obvious joy, shaking the water from his fur, rolling in the damp grass, enjoying the sensation of water on his skin. He would position himself so that Luna could see him, could see what he was experiencing, could witness his delight in this sensory experience. Luna, watching from her side with what appeared to be amusement, would sometimes venture to the edge of her patio, where the spray could reach her, if the wind was right, and she would stand in the mist too, experiencing the same sensation, the same coolness, the same gentle spray. She moved through the water with more restraint than Mason, with a kind of deliberate grace, but her eyes would close with obvious pleasure, and her whole body would seem to relax into the relief the cooling brought. It was a shared experience, a moment when they were both undergoing the same thing simultaneously, and there was something particularly precious about those moments. They were connected not just by sight and proximity and love, but by the actual experience of feeling the same water droplets, breathing the same misty air, standing in the same cooling relief. On these evenings, they would sometimes move toward each other through the spray, and water droplets would cling to the fence between them, creating prisms of light that caught and refracted the last rays of the sun, turning their humble fence into something magical and beautiful. As evening turned into night, the quality of their interactions would shift once more. The neighbourhood would quiet, lights would come on in houses, the day would settle into its own kind of conclusion. Crickets would begin their nightly chorus, and the air would take on a particular quality that both Mason and Luna seemed to cherish. Mason and Luna would continue their vigil at the fence, but now there was something even more intimate about their presence together. The darkness made their connection feel more profound, more concentrated, as if all the distractions of the day had fallen away, and there was nothing left but the essential fact of their existence alongside each other. They would stand together in the darkness, and sometimes the moon would come out and illuminate them with soft, silver light that made everything seem dreamlike and eternal, and sometimes clouds would cover the sky and they would be in near complete darkness, able to see each other only because they had spent so much time together that they knew each other's shapes, each other's presence in a way that didn't require sight. In these dark moments, they would sometimes touch the fence gently with their faces, would press themselves as close to it as they could manage, would exist in a state of togetherness that transcended the wooden barrier between them. Mason would often rest his head against the fence for long periods, and Luna would curl up on her side, just beyond it, and there would be a kind of meditative quality to their presence together in the night. As night deepened and the neighbourhood fell into sleep, both Mason and Luna would eventually return to their homes, to their people, to their separate spaces, but they did so knowing that they would return again in the morning, knowing that this rhythm would continue, knowing that tomorrow would bring the same cycles and rituals and moments of connection that today had brought. There was a comfort in this certainty, a deep satisfaction in knowing that the day's ending was not final, that it was simply a pause in an ongoing conversation, a temporary separation that made the reunion all the more precious. They had learned that absence made the reunion more sweet, that time apart allowed them to appreciate each other's presence all the more fully when they returned. This was how they lived now, Mason and Luna, in a state of quiet dedication to each other, in a rhythm that had become the organising principle of both their days. Everything else in their lives was secondary to this central relationship. Food, comfort, play, rest, all of these things took on new meaning when they were experienced with the awareness that the other was there too, that the other mattered, that the other was thinking of them even when they couldn't see each other. Their friendship had become a kind of meditation for both of them, a practice that brought them more and more deeply into the present moment, that helped them appreciate the simple fact of existence, the remarkable gift of being alive in a world with another being who cared about them, who loved them, who had chosen them as their companion on this journey through time. One particular day arrived that seemed different from all the others, though neither Mason nor Luna could have explained exactly why. The morning had started the same as always, with the greeting at the fence, with the sense of rightness that came from being together again after the night's separation. But as the day progressed, something in the air seemed to shift. The sky was particularly clear, the light was particularly golden, and both Mason and Luna felt an unusual sense of energy and alertness. Mason's person had noticed this too, and they had decided to spend the day in the garden, working on various projects, spending more time outside than usual. This meant that Mason was able to spend an extended period of time near the fence, able to be more present with Luna than he usually could be. Luna, too, seemed to understand that this was a special day. She spent most of her time on her patio in the garden areas, as close to Mason as she could be. The presence of the humans in the gardens added a new dimension to their interaction. Mason's person would sometimes acknowledge Luna, offering her a friendly greeting, sometimes even providing her with a bowl of cool water. Luna's people seemed pleased to see how much their cat enjoyed spending time in the garden, and they encouraged her to stay outside, to enjoy the beautiful weather. At one point during the afternoon, Mason's person decided to open the side gate fully, not just leaving it unlatched, but actually propping it open to provide better access to the side yard where they were doing some work. The gate swung wide, creating an opening that was large enough for Mason to pass through easily, to venture into the space beyond, to potentially reach Luna in a completely new way. For a moment, Mason felt the familiar surge of possibility, the awareness that the barrier could be crossed, that the separation could be bridged in a physical, tangible way. But he found that he didn't feel the urgent need to move through that opening that he'd felt before. The desperation and longing that might have driven him to cross that threshold in earlier days was no longer present. Instead, he chose to remain at the main fence, at the place where he and Luna had spent so much time together, at the spot that had become sacred to them. It was not resignation or defeat, it was choice. It was a conscious decision to honour the space they had made, to acknowledge that what they had created here, in this small corner of the world, was more valuable than any physical togetherness could be. Luna noticed the open gate too, and like Mason, she chose to remain where she was, on her side of the fence, in the space they had made theirs. She could have wandered to the opening, and investigated this new possibility. Instead, she stayed close to her side of the fence, her eyes on Mason, her attention completely focused on him. It was almost as if they were acknowledging that the physical crossing no longer mattered, that they had already crossed every barrier that truly counted. The fence no longer represented separation. It represented the boundary of the space they had created together, the frame around their shared life. It was the thing that held their love in place, that marked the limits of their special world, that kept what was precious and fragile at its center, protected from the larger world beyond. As the afternoon turned golden and the light began to shift toward evening, Mason and Luna found themselves standing closer together than they ever had before. The open gate was still available, the possibility still existed, but they chose presence and connection over the chance to be in the same physical space. They had discovered something more valuable than proximity. They had discovered that true connection transcended location, that being together was not primarily about occupying the same physical place, but about being fully aware of each other, fully present, fully committed to honouring and cherishing the other. They stood at the fence, separated by wood and nails and weathering, but united in a way that no physical barrier could ever divide. They could feel each other's presence so completely that the fence seemed almost irrelevant, almost invisible. The fence was there, yes, but it was not what defined them. What defined them was the connection that had grown between them, the bonds that had been woven from countless moments of choice and commitment and love. What they had built between them was so solid, so real, so absolutely certain that no material obstruction could diminish it. No gate, open or closed, no fence painted or weathered, no distance whether measured in feet or miles. Nothing could touch what they had created in that sacred space where their two worlds met. As the sun began to set and paint the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple, both creatures felt a sense of completion, a sense that this day, this particularly beautiful day, had confirmed what they already knew. They were not just friends bound by proximity or circumstance. They were friends bound by choice, by commitment, by a love that had grown from initial curiosity into something deep and true and permanent. The setting sun seemed to bless their friendship, seemed to affirm what they had created together. When Mason finally turned away from the fence and walked back toward his home, it was not with sadness at the separation, but with gratitude for the day they had shared. When Luna turned away and moved back toward her house, it was with the same feeling of gratitude, the same certainty that tomorrow would bring new moments of connection, new opportunities to be together, new ways to express the bond that held them so securely to each other. That night, as Mason rested in his favourite spot in his home, curled up on his cushion, he dreamed of Luna. His dreams were vivid and real, full of the two of them walking together through gardens that had no fences, existing in a space where the barrier between them had dissolved completely. In his sleep, he experienced a kind of union with her that was perhaps even deeper than what they could achieve while awake, a merging of consciousness that transcended the limitations of their physical forms. Luna too was dreaming, and in her dreams she was running alongside Mason, the two of them moving together across fields of impossible green, through gardens that bloomed with flowers of every colour imaginable. Their dreams intersected and overlapped, weaving together into a shared landscape of love and connection that existed in that realm between waking and sleeping, in that place where the rules of the physical world no longer applied. When morning came, they woke separately, but with the memory of their shared dreams somehow still present in their consciousness, still lending a particular quality to their meeting at the fence. There was a new depth to their connection now, a sense that they had been together even while they slept, that their bonds extended into realms beyond the physical. This knowledge made their reunion even more precious, even more sacred. They greeted each other with the same ritual they had performed countless times before, but it felt brand new, felt freshly miraculous, as if they were discovering each other for the first time, as if they were falling in love all over again. The days that followed seemed to build on this foundation of deeper connection. Mason and Luna fell into their established rhythms with even more intentionality, even more presence. They had become not just friends, but partners, creatures who had found in each other a kind of completion that made the world feel whole and right. Every interaction was infused with the knowledge that they were lucky to have found each other, that in a vast world full of billions of creatures, they had been brought together, had recognized something in each other worth nurturing, had chosen to invest their time and energy and love in building a relationship that would sustain them both. The fence that had once seemed so forbidding, so absolute in its separation, had transformed into something beautiful. It became a testament to what could be achieved when two beings refused to accept limitation, when they found creative ways to connect despite the obstacles in their path. The fence was no longer a barrier, it was a monument to the power of love, a physical reminder that nothing in this world is powerful enough to divide those who are truly committed to being together. In the quiet moments before sleep, both Mason and Luna would think of each other. Mason, lying in his basket, would recall the feeling of Luna's presence, would remember the way the afternoon light had fallen on her fur, would feel grateful for the existence of this being who had become so central to his world. Luna, settling into her favourite spot, would hold in her heart the memory of Mason's loyalty, his unwavering devotion, his absolute faith in the goodness of their connection. They had become each other's reason for being, each other's purpose, each other's home. They had transformed the concept of friendship, had redefined what it meant to be together, had created a relationship that transcended every limitation and obstacle that the world had placed in their path. As weeks turned into months and months began to accumulate into a history of shared moments and shared understanding, Mason and Luna became inseparable, in spirit if not in body. They had achieved something rare and precious, something that many creatures spend their entire lives searching for without ever finding. They had found their person, their mirror, their other half. They had found home in each other, and in that finding, they had discovered the greatest truth of all, that love, true love, is not about being in the same place, or having unlimited access to someone. Love is about choosing to be present, about committing to see and be seen by another being, about building something that neither of them could have created alone. Mason and Luna had created a masterpiece of friendship, a work of art that existed in every moment they spent together, in every glance exchanged across the fence, in every shared breath and shared experience. They had proven that the deepest connections can happen in the most unlikely circumstances, that barriers can become doorways, that separation can become the foundation for the most profound unity. The world outside their fence continued to turn. Seasons changed, other creatures came and went, but Mason and Luna remained constant, remained devoted, remained true. They were not the same creatures who had first met across that fence, curious but cautious, hopeful but uncertain. They had grown together, had been shaped by their love for each other, had become versions of themselves that were stronger and more complete and more fully alive because the other existed. They had answered the eternal question of whether true friendship was possible, and they had answered with an emphatic yes. Not just possible, but inevitable. Not just likely, but certain. When two beings recognize each other across any distance, when they see in each other something worth loving, when they choose, day after day, to honor and cherish that connection, nothing in the world can stand between them. Nothing can diminish what they have built. Nothing can convince them that their bond is anything less than sacred, anything less than the most important thing in their lives. Mason and Luna had become what every being secretly hopes to find. Not just a friend, but a true friend. A companion for life, a witness to existence, a fellow traveller on this long journey from beginning to end. and in finding that in each other, they had found everything.